that it must precede all other considerations that come across his desk. Well, obviously, he signed on for Israel. Period. Congratulations, Mike. Perhaps they'll award you citizenship. But damn it, if you're serious about the United States, you take care of this country first. We haven't done that. I would be happy to see the 61 billion headed for Ukraine to go into immediate commitment of U.S. forces and security on the borders, all the borders, but particularly the southern border, as well as bringing the Coast Guard back from overseas to patrol our waters. That's number one. At that point, I'm happy to discuss all other requests, including the Israeli ones, because obviously Israel is not Ukraine. It's a different animal entirely, and we have different kinds of interests in Israel from those in Ukraine. But I don't see it happening, Dan. It's really endlessly frustrating to me. And this is because we've gotten away with printing money irrationally and recklessly. We've destroyed our financial system. It's going to implode. All you have to do is pick up Alistair MacLeod, James Rickards, go into any of these people, all these people are telling you it's not a question of whether or not our financial system will crack and break, it's when. And by the same token, the financial system and the government spending that it subsists on, and it really does, is what keeps the economy going. What do we build? What do we create? What do we manufacture? Answer the question, please. What do we export? What do we
As a matter of fact, Doug, on that point, we actually have something else to show. Part of Zelensky's visit here was, of course, to have the high profile with the president and then also with the Senate and the House. But there was another visit today which got a little bit more interest, and that is with some of the titans of the defense industry. There's I'm going to read you some of the names of some of the people at whose hands he's shaking right now. Those the president of BAE Systems, Boeing president, CEO of Sierra Nevada Corp, Northrop Grumman, RTX, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and several others. I mean, all he's doing right there in that whole, happy picture there, that's not about defending Ukraine. That's about expanding the bottom lines of our defense industry and having all these contracts going on here. So I think they're showing their hand about what this is really about here in the United States.
Well, I know some of these people, Dan, and I understand them. They're about money. They're about lining their pockets. They're about what we call shareholder value. They don't really care about most of the employees under them. They don't care whether or not they're producing anything that's really what we need. In fact, I've sat with many executives over the years and they said, well, look, we agree with you. We recommend, we agree with your recommendations and we'd be happy to do that. But you have to understand that's not what we're asked to do. When Congress and the generals and the admirals meet with us, they just want more of what they've already got. And, we're in business. So thanks very much. It's been an interesting afternoon. Good luck. God bless. We're going to keep producing things we don't need. That is, that the American people and the national defense doesn't need. I don't know how you fix that because money drives everything. And that's all they care about. And that's not surprising. And I'm not faulting them for taking the position that they are responsible for large corporations and, of course, shareholder value. I hate that shareholder value term because up until World War II, we used to talk about providing the best possible product at the most reasonable price. That's all gone now.
Yeah.
We provide whatever we want to provide to make as much money as possible for our shareholders. And frankly, most of those guys are not engineers. They didn't come up through any assembly lines. They're not innovators. Most of those people are financial gurus and lawyers. For God's sakes, what do you expect them to do? I mean, people that are, you and I have talked about what was wrong with the M1 tank series back in 1991, none of which has been fixed. Well, why is that? They don't care about it. They're going to ship you whatever the M1 is. Okay, General, that's what you want. You got it. If that's what you want, Congressman, you got it. Is that what you want, Senator? You got it. Again, that's if you want to play in that arena, that's what you do. You don't,
Doug. I remember a conversation you and I had. I want to say 2007 or 8, somewhere around there, when I was in the Future Combat Systems program at Fort Bliss at the time, before it was canned and shut down. and we had this conversation because you had already had Breaking the Phalanx, and I think you'd already had another book out at that time on military modernization, transformation under fire, I believe is what we were talking about at that time, to where you'd laid out, like, look, here's the problems of the FCS. Here's the problem with all the technology they're trying to pursue. And you talked to industry. I remember you told me that you talked to some of the industry people and said, here's what we need. Here's what will actually work. And they said, yeah, we can do that. But only orders we're getting are for more M1s and upgraded M1s and these things that are never going to come into pass. And we'll spend lots of money on making those things as long as they keep it going. But it's not what is going to make anything work. And you pointed that out in at least 2008. And now here we are in 2023. Nothing's changed.
Well, I remember a corporate officer from the firm that ultimately became primarily responsible for FCS. And he had just attended a meeting, and he had met with the Army Chief of Staff at the time, who was General Shinseki. And he was brought over to see me by someone who had served with me that said, after he'd come out of the meeting, he was frustrated. And they said, let me go introduce you to this colonel. I served under him, and you'll really appreciate what he has to say. So he came in. We sat and talked for about 45 minutes. But he opened the discussion by saying that the things that the Army wanted at that point were simply not realistic, couldn't be attained. You'd have to break the laws of physics and fractal mathematics and everything else if you were going to get the things the Chief of Staff wanted. And whenever you said that, the Chief of Staff made it clear, well, if you're not going to do what I want you to do, I'll spend the money with someone else. And so he said, we finally decided if we don't take the contract, we're going to lose all this money because it'll just go to some other Big Five defense firm, and then they'll get the billions of dollars that we would have otherwise gotten. So I said, yeah, no, I understand that. That's unfortunate, but you absolutely positively know that it won't work. Sure, we know that. And, I'd have difficulty doing that because I was a soldier like you, and I would be very concerned about whatever we provided to people. But, there's good news at the end of this tunnel, and you know what it is. FCS never provided anything. So you and I can rest assured that all the people that were there made general, and they went on to great glory, and program managers made lots of money, but nothing came of it. And that was all right because Congress was preeminently concerned about the money being spent.
And I almost hate to bring this up, but speaking of generals and them, trying to grease the trough there, we had another general again today making some very interesting comments about the Ukraine situation. And, I'll just let him speak for himself.
Ukraine has not failed. I think we in the West have failed. We failed to commit strategically to Ukraine winning, and therefore we have failed to deliver those capabilities that Ukraine needs and has expected. But also just the psychological aspect. We have not said we want Ukraine to win.
Wow. It's hard to even reply to that. We haven't said we want Ukraine to win, and them not winning is our fault. Like, we didn't give them enough stuff, and I don't know, maybe we didn't fight for them, but man, Ben Hodges is a really strange cat when it comes to just like almost ignoring patent reality on the battlefield.
Well, I don't think he's particularly strange. I think he's pretty standard for what we get right now in the senior ranks of the armed forces. First of all, I'd find out who he's working for in retirement and identify the cash source that sustains him and pays for stupid remarks on television. That's what everybody needs to do. I wish that every time some former or retired general officer came on board to share his brilliance with the American public, that someone somewhere underneath his name, someone would write, oh, this man works for, who is it, Lockheed Martin, or this think tank, which is ultimately a front for this corporation and these people, or a foreign lobby, and on and on and on. And we've got a lot of foreign lobbies that pretend to be domestic lobbies. So it's an enormous problem. That would be helpful. But there's something else with Hodges, and I really think he jumped out of too many airplanes in the airborne without a helmet, because the remarks that he makes are phenomenally stupid. And I don't know what his experience is on the ground fighting anybody, but I don't think he knows much about it. I don't think he's studied his profession or warfare. Those are the best things that I can say.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's just so divorced from what's physically on the ground in reality. And let's talk about that for a second, because most of the conversation here in the United States, and as you saw from Schumer before, is about we need to give Ukraine this money so that they'll lose. The implication being that money is what they're missing here. If they just had more cash, then all these things that we saw on the battlefield are going to be reversed. But
Well,
as
Dan,
this British fellow said a second ago, he goes, people are asking the question, if 200 billion, 200 billion didn't do anything, why is another 61 billion going to make any difference? And what do you see, Doug, on the battlefield, say over the next 6 months?
well, I don't think it'll go on for another 6 months, frankly. I mean, we may never install a new government that will do our bidding. If that is the case, then perhaps something else will emerge. I hear people say, "Oh, well, Zelensky, he's admittedly terrible, criminal, crooked, corrupt, so forth. But Zelensky, General Zelensky, he's a really great person, and he really cares." Yeah, right. If he'd have given a damn, he'd have stopped this a long time ago. One of my favorite anecdotes from the Second World War, and this is a German officer who lived through it and fought through it, and he said to me, "Now, Stalingrad falls on the 2nd of February, 1943. And Hitler's birthday is the 20th of April. And by the 20th of April, all of the senior generals of the German armed forces signed a pledge of allegiance, effectively, to Adolf Hitler, congratulating him on his birthday and pledging their allegiance to him come what may." He said there was not a single solitary German general with the patriotism and the compassion, if for nothing else, for the German soldiers and German people, to stand up and say, someone needs to remove this man, or better yet, I've got a pistol, I'll go do it. Incomprehensible. Now, eventually they get around to it, but it was too late. It was too weak. Imagine that. How many lives could have been saved by removing that man in 1943? It didn't happen. It was, they stayed in the same rut. That's what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with it in Ukraine. We're dealing with it everywhere. What do you think is going to help the Israeli Defense Force to, quote unquote, win in Gaza? Well, let's send them 45,000 more tank shells. Let's send them 200 more 2,000-pound bombs with precision strike kits. And it's not going to work. Oh, yeah, you can flatten Gaza. You can expel the population. You can kill large numbers of them. Are you really winning anything? Is that going to buy Israel security? Well, then we move on to the West Bank, or we move up to Hezbollah.
Right.
Good luck. This is not going to work. And covering up the truth, and I think you and many others have pointed to it, I don't have the sources from Israel that I did for Eastern Europe, so I don't have confidence in the numbers. All I can do is read what a journalist in Israel says, or what comes out in Haaretz and so forth. But if they're close to being right, and the Israelis have lost 3,700 plus dead already in uniform in Gaza, how many more are they likely to lose against Hezbollah, or what are they going to lose in the West Bank? All the while, the rest of the region is mobilizing quietly, but they're mobilizing, and none of the governments want to fight. Everybody knows that, but the populations do. They are enraged, and we may see some of these Arab regimes in particular go away for the very reason they've done nothing to this point. So I just see no good news in any of this, but I see no one in charge, because the people in charge are sitting primarily today in Jerusalem. They're running the show, and they're telling us what they want, and they're telling us what we will do and what we will provide. Fine. What's going on in Kiev right now? Not much. It's hopeless. Everybody knows that. People are still dying. 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old men are going out there and being killed. Young women are being killed. 13, 14, 15-year-old boys are being killed. The Ukrainian secret police is running around giving a good demonstration of what the NKVD was like for Stalin. Stalin murdered 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight against the Germans. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if we're not going to see many, many more thousands refuse to fight in this war against the Russians, and for good reasons. The problem is no one will stand up and be counted. We're back to the failure in April 1943 to finally say, no, this must end here and now. So where do we go from here? I think it gets worse. I think things escalate. Now, just before I came on, I saw something in Zero Hedge about a supposed proposal from Mr. Netanyahu to make some sort of agreement with Hezbollah that would put U.S. and French troops on the border between Israel and Hezbollah. Once again, I'm sure Mike Johnson thinks this is a great idea. In the meantime, there are no troops on our border, but he's probably quite willing to put U.S. troops on the Israeli border, which I think would be a catastrophe.
Oh, yeah, it'd be disaster.
But beyond that, it sort of sounds like some version of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Let's buy some time here with a temporary ceasefire, and then we can go back to it later. It's not going to lead to anything, and I would privately be very surprised if Hezbollah and any of its supporters in Tehran think this is a good idea. Why would you place your trust and confidence in any of this? And if you look at our behavior in Ukraine and the things that we have said about the Russians, they're almost as bad as what Netanyahu and the president of Israel, Herzog, have said about the Arabs. They're animals, subhuman. We've almost said things that bad about the Russians.
Russians, yeah.
Why would anybody trust anything we cooked up, let alone the Israelis?
Yeah, and then therein is your problem, and there's just continues to be the lack of any willingness to look at just the fundamental realities on the ground. And I mean, that even goes so far as to right now, with even within the Democrats of talking about this money, other than these bumper stickers of they will win if we give them the money. No one knows what that means. So they're not even articulating, even if you say the money should go onto the border or anything else, or just not get borrowed, they're not even putting out a basic answer of, what is the money going to be used for? How is this going to change the outcome of the previous 22 months? And how is that in America's national interest? And what's the end game? How does this lead to some kind of a negotiated settlement that gets us back to a period of no war? We don't even seem to be interested in no war. We only seem to be interested in this fiction that says, no, we desire for Russia to lose. I've heard that a ton of times, but no plan or path or even idea how to get there.
Well, we're an 18-wheeler. We have an enfeebled human being sitting behind the wheel who's taking instructions from people sitting next to him and behind him. And the 18-wheeler is fully loaded and has no brakes. And we can see as we're headed down the side of this particular mountain that at the bottom of the mountain, there is nothing but concrete barriers. I think that's where we're headed collectively as a society. I think that's where we're headed as a nation. And that's where we have dragged our allies in NATO with us. And I'm afraid that by failing to exercise any kind of restraint and control over this event, the events since 7 October, that we're dragging Israel down with us. And again, everyone that saw 7 October, and I included this, the Arabs, heads of state, they were all appalled. There's no question about that. It's not up for debate. It's terrible. Yeah. And lots of people could look at that and say, well, these people deserve an object lesson. All right. What's the object lesson? 5,000, 10,000 dead, how many houses, whatever. But it's just beyond that now. This has now become a war from the standpoint of the Arabs, Iranians and Turks. They see this as a war for Jewish supremacy in the region. It's not like the wars in the past. Remember, in the wars in the past, some territory was picked up. Sometimes it was exchanged. Prisoners were exchanged. And then there was a period of time where you had periodic outbursts, but not entirely peace, but certainly not war. And then we've had this 50-year pause in Egypt because of the agreements that were reached there, which I think were enormously important and valuable. And now they're very much at risk. I don't see any of that, as you say. I see no diplomacy. What I see are people determined to eradicate those that they hate. And hate breeds more hatred. Blood begets more blood.
Right.
It's not going to solve anything. It's going to end badly. I think it's going to end badly for all of us. On that happy note, I wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. And as we continue to I guess, look on to what's next, it just troubles me that I whether Mike Johnson ends up giving in or some combination of that. I can't imagine that Rand Paul, who we had on this show last week, talk about how, he said, I don't think there should be any more money, but I bet there'll be some more money coming in. But then no one tells me what's next, or no one's given that consideration because, Doug, tell me, I mean, if there is some let's say, for example, you were given command control of all the armed forces in the area. Is there some plan? Is there some path that if they only follow the Ukrainian side, that they could either achieve a stalemate or even in time roll back Russia? Does such a plan exist?
No. What I would say if I were in command of the armed forces right now is it is imperative, whether we like it or not, that we sit down privately and listen to what the Russians demand. It's that simple. There's no longer an opportunity to negotiate whatever the people in Kyiv think is equitable. Too many people have died. Too much time has been lost. Too much bad blood has been spilled. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to stop fighting. You need an immediate ceasefire in place. And then you have to have a meeting on the battlefield, preferably somewhere in eastern Ukraine where the fighting is being going on. They bring their maps, everybody shows up, and they make some sort of agreement about disengagement. Meanwhile, once that disengagement is underway, they've got to sit down somewhere else on a political level with the leading diplomats, advised by their military experts, as to how they're going to redraw the map. And everyone acts like, oh, you can't redraw the map. Do you realize how many hundreds of times the maps of Eastern Europe and the Middle East have been redrawn? How many empires have risen and fallen over hundreds of years? It's nonsensical. You got to stop the fighting. It's sort of what's the first thing you do in an emergency situation when you find someone that's injured? Well, I tell you, number one, first step, stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
Clear the airway. I mean, you just go down the list. All right. First thing we need to do is stop the bleeding. If you can stop the bleeding long enough and go through the steps that I just suggested, disengagement, I think something similar, frankly, needs to happen with the Israelis. But I think we're far further from that right now than we are in Ukraine. But right now, that's what's in Ukraine's interest, and not Mr. Zelensky and the crooks and criminals who have been stealing everything they get their hands on, who all have bank accounts in Cyprus and homes in Italy somewhere. I'm talking about the Ukrainian people and the nation.
Yeah.
They're the ones that have to be saved from this wreckage. That can be done. But I don't think we can do it, Dan. I mean, are we going to be trusted? Is anybody going to listen to us? You know,
and so all we want to do is say for as long as it takes and whatever they want. And so there's not even any concept of that. That's been one of the most disheartening things to me for the better part of this year, is that there's not any effort, not any intention at all to bring the war to an end, only to just give whatever Kiev asked for. And here's the perverse part. What you just laid out there is the one plan I have seen that could actually succeed, could end the war, could end the destruction of Ukraine, what's left of it, end the killing, and actually has a shot. Even that's not guaranteed because of the distrust that's been built up over the last 20 years in Russia and elsewhere, but it's got a solid shot. What we're doing now has the greatest possibility of losing yet more territory for Ukraine, more people to die pointlessly, and then we won't have a choice at some point, Doug. I think at some point we're just given terms and that's it. That's the end of the war. I think that's where we're heading if we don't do what you said now.
I think strategically we are set up for a Dunkirk. It's coming. Instead of leaving Europe, amidst fond farewells and waves, I think we're going to end up in a position where people are telling us to get out as quickly as possible. And by the way, don't come back. We've not simply overstayed our welcome. We've now destroyed European economies, and our influence has profoundly affected the European society. We're the ones that said, if you don't let these millions of non-Europeans into your societies, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of who they are and what they did, then you're a racist. And if you're racist, we don't approve, obviously, of many of his advisors, but I think it's paid off handsomely because he's weakened us to the point where, frankly, I don't think NATO presents much of a threat whatsoever to Russia. And despite the attempts to frame Russia as this great power with an insatiable appetite for conquest and territorial control, there's no evidence for it. None. The Russians could have moved offensively to the west, I would think, anytime since probably the beginning of March even earlier, but certainly for weather reasons, March and April would have been better. They haven't done it because very clearly Putin does not want to put Moscow in the position of having to referee and manage Eastern Europe. Far from it. He simply wants to retain control of those areas that are Russian. And as he said over and over and over again, historically Russian. And he's right. And that means Odessa all the way to Kharkov, essentially in this sort of banana form that you have in the eastern and southeastern parts of the contemporary Ukraine. And I think he's waiting for someone to step forward and take ownership of the disaster in Kiev. We certainly will not do it. We never do. Normally, when things go badly for us, we simply pack up our bags, get on our airplanes, get on ships, and leave. But we don't take responsibility for any of the damage that we've done. Europeans need to understand this, and I don't think they get it. They still don't understand that we do not live in Europe. And I would not want, as a European, to pin my hopes forever on a power that is thousands of miles away with a whole set of interests that are mercurial. And when I say mercurial, I mean it. We do have real strategic interests, we Americans. Most of those are in the Western Hemisphere, and those are the ones we are ignoring. It's interesting that the same class that wants to make war against Russia is responsible for flooding Europe with millions of unwanted people from the Near East and North Africa, and in the United States with people from Latin America, as well as people from Africa, the Near East, all over the world, people that we can't employ, people we cannot afford to sustain, people that are contributing to the breakdown in the rule of law inside the United States. So it's a very strange juxtaposition. On the one hand, we have this relentless war in eastern Ukraine that we are pushing hard when it makes absolutely no sense to do so. And there's no evidence for any of the assertions we made about Russia. And at the same time, we're ignoring our own security in the Western Hemisphere. I think you have a similar situation. I hope the Europeans will come to their senses as soon as possible and step forward and take ownership of the disaster for no other reason, because it needs to end if there is to be any Ukraine at all.
Yeah, well, you allude to this duality of the way Russia's referred to in the Western media, because either it's almost collapsing or it's about to conquer the world. So it's always not either or, but sometimes it's both of these extremes at the same time. So it appears to overcome this period of Russia is hopelessly backwards and failing, and now we're speaking of whether or not Russia will conquer all of Ukraine and then go after NATO. So it's again, we dialed it to the other end now, but it doesn't seem that Europe is wanting to bring this to an end, because the rhetoric from Germany now suggests that if the United States is not going to send more weapons, then they have to increase it. And I hear the same rhetoric from other European countries as well. So I'm not sure if that's possible to replace the United States militarily, but I was curious how you see the fronts are shifting now, because after this failed offensive by the Ukrainians since the summer, the Russians obviously has gone on the offensive now, and one is getting pretty bad news coming out of Ukraine as well from the political and military leadership, in which they're suggesting cracks are emerging, and Russia's responding obviously to this. I was just wondering how do you see the front lines moving in the time to come, or what do you think the Russians will do? Do you think they're going to open a new front in Sumy or Kharkov, or do you see anything of the sorts?
Well, Moscow has made it clear they want the demilitarization of Ukraine, period. They want the so-called denazification of Ukraine, which I always thought was an interesting view, because I see it as being deglobalized, if you will, and Ukraine is supposed to denazifying. I think most of the silly nonsense with Nazi symbols is limited to a small number, but nevertheless a menacing number. And then finally, he's made it very clear that after demilitarization and denazification, that he will not accept a Ukraine that is anything other than neutral. So these are, I think, eminently reasonable objectives, all of which can be attained. Now, we have obstructed Russia on all all counts, but frankly, let's be honest, we're not in a position militarily to obstruct much longer if we ever were to begin with. In other words, NATO has exhausted its military capacity, in my judgment. I see no evidence for Norwegians, Spaniards, Frenchmen, Germans, Greeks, or Poles all lining up to march east in the Great Crusade to quote unquote save Ukraine. I don't see much interest in Ukraine at all, other than keeping it out of the EU under certain circumstances because of the competitiveness of Ukrainian agriculture. But setting all of that aside, I think the Russians are moving cautiously but deliberately forward. I don't think they want to absorb any of the Ukrainian population if they can avoid it. Everybody sort of looks at me strangely when the United States, and I say this, and I said, but the Russians really don't want to rule Ukrainians. And if you look at most of these areas that we're talking about right now that the Russians already control, they're Russian, filled with Russians, people that speak Russian. We used to say, well, Ukrainian citizens speak Russian. All right, fine. They're Russians. Kharkov is one of those. Odessa has always been a Russian-speaking city, so is Kharkov. So until those are taken, this is not over. I think he would rather sit down at the negotiating table and come to a solution that would give Russia what it wants ultimately, and no one will step forward to do that, with the exception of some isolated figures that we don't hear a great deal about in the Russian or the Ukrainian military. Now, this man Arestovich, who headed Ukrainian intelligence, I guess, is now stepped forward and made some comments that are leading people to believe that he might be able to step into the vacuum. The problem right now for Russia and for us and for the East, for the rest of Europe, is that most of the people at the top are all corrupt. They are sort of smothered in corruption. People come to me all the time, well, don't you think Zaluzhny is a good general and everything else? Well, I can't really evaluate that based on performance. I'd say no, a pretty bad general. Well, don't you think he could replace Zelensky? Really? Where's the evidence for that? Is he less corrupt? Has he got a different worldview that's going to put an end to this conflict? This is the problem. The West is looking for someone else to step in and replace Zelensky, but Zelensky, getting rid of him, of course, is a very positive development, don't get me wrong, but that's not the only problem. And in the meantime, you know, we've done something that the old Soviet imperial establishment used to do. We've extended citizenship to someone like Zelensky and told him that he can come live in the United States and he'll be protected by security and perpetuity because he's been a loyal servant of the greater American empire. I find that detestable, distasteful, but I think that's in the offing. This kind of thing is left us in a terrible position, Glenn. We have no easy way to turn, and so we just continue to count the dead, and the dead continue to mount in terms of numbers. Europeans are beginning to get a sense of it, but they still haven't been told the truth. Very recently, I'm sure you're aware that the MI6 and CIA got together and cooked up this ridiculous notion that 315,000 Russians had been killed. It's laughable nonsense. Based on this big lie that at the beginning the Russians were incompetent and stupid and the Ukrainians just had a field day and killed them all. Well, that was never really true. It's not true today. At some point, we have to put an end to it. And Europeans have to come to terms with reality, but Europeans seem to be very, very wedded to the mainstream media. I mean, I'm sure if you and others, and you know, your friends on the Duran, they stand up and speak, and buckets of filth and abuse are poured all over them as Russian agents. Now, I don't see much evidence for the Russian agency, but nevertheless, this is the problem. And the people that control finance, the people that control the media, and the people that control our governments are the same people. This is very tribal. These individuals are all part of the same class, and they all share the same goals. And what we think, or what is in the interests of us as Europeans or people anywhere, simply don't matter. These are ideologues in the worst sense of the word, and they're up against a foe that cannot be defeated. And what I mean by that is that if you look at Russia, and it's a nationalist state, which is one of the reasons that the globalist class wants to destroy it because they have been working to denationalize us, to denationalize Norway, denationalize Germany, denationalize France, erase the history or revise it to conform to some Marxist narrative that makes absolutely no sense and is irrelevant. And this sort of Marxist worldview is losing. It's been losing from the beginning. It has never really worked. And I see something similar happening in the Middle East, because what's rising now is not widespread support for Israel. Israel's support is dropping through the cellar for obvious reasons. But if you look at the region is a boiling cauldron of what I would call ethno-religious nationalism. People are rediscovering that they are all Muslims, whether they are Arabs, Turks, or Persians, whether they are Shiite or Sunni. Everyone in Russia's national consciousness and identity has been strengthened by the war, far, far more so than our identity is irrelevant. We haven't fought. You and I and the rest of the West, we are not engaged in the fighting. The fighting has been done exclusively by the poor Ukrainians who thought they were fighting something they aren't and thought they were fighting for something they don't have. In other words, the notions of liberal democracy, there's nothing remotely liberal or democratic about this man Zelensky and his horrible regime. He has much more in common with Leon Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. But we don't seem to see that. We are not getting that because the media and finance and the government rest comfortably in the hands of the same elites. Now, I don't think they're going to be able to conceal it too much longer, but I'm amazed that they've gotten away with it this long. Very shortly, I think we're going to see developments in the Middle East that are going to make it even worse for us in the West in connection with all of these forces.
Arestovich, the former advisor to Zelensky, which you mentioned, he actually came out with a statement suggesting that, well, not suggesting, explicitly stating that Ukraine had bet on the wrong horse, that they had put themselves in the globalist class when, from what they're seeing, the ability to mobilize, passionate support and the future effectively lie among the states who have leaned more on the nation states. So it's interesting he would point that out, but it does seem now that the economy is going through a hardship. They don't have the same access to weapons. They can't get enough manpower. I mean, they're mobilizing women now and minors and everything, but this translates into very unreliable forces. So you have more people surrendering, more people withdrawing, and I'm just curious. Everyone seems now to acknowledge that either it's stalemate or more realistically, Ukraine is losing. So everyone's reporting on this every day. They're losing more territory, and their situation becoming worse. So I don't understand completely the situation in Washington now. Once strategic territory is lost, and there's no way to reverse it, this is not the time you want to sit down and talk. I know the Russians recently suggested that. They've given up on talking to Washington. They will demand capitulation from now on. But is there no one in Washington really pushing for a negotiated settlement, given that no one really has any vision for any success on the battlefield?
Well, there are some people that advocate a negotiated end and some form of settlement with Russia, but they're a very small minority. I mean, I can count them on one hand. You've got someone like Senator Tuberville from Alabama, Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, probably Mike Lee from Utah. That's just the Senate. I imagine that you have perhaps 40, maybe 50 members of the House that feel that way, but those numbers are minuscule and they shrink to insignificance next to the numbers that are effectively on the globalist payroll. You have to understand that the last 30 years of what I would call crusading ideology of regime change and forcible conversion to some mythological liberal democracy has been very rewarding financially for the people in power. It has been, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, everybody blames it on the Department of Defense and blames it on the so-called military-industrial congressional complex. Obviously, that's part of it. But there's more to it than that. Remember that the beast, this military-industrial congressional complex, wants to be fed, but it's still agnostic about how it's fed. There's nobody over there saying, well, we got to destroy everybody in Ukraine. In fact, right now they could care less about Ukraine. They've made all their money. They're shifting their attention to the Middle East and trying to figure out how they can benefit from the war in the Middle East involving Israel, because our support to this point for Israel has been unconditional. Doesn't make any difference what Israel does. We support Israel. Well, that's very lucrative for the Department of Defense and its military-industrial supporters. That's not going to change. So the short answer to your question is I see no evidence for a readiness to negotiate an end to anything anywhere at the moment. Now, that could change depending upon the setbacks in the Middle East in particular. And I think those are coming. In fact, I think they've already begun, because this small state of Israel has bitten off a huge chunk of its problem and is now choking on that chunk. And that's called Gaza. And Gaza, of course, is a modest feature of the problem in Israeli geostrategic landscape. Hezbollah to the north of Israel makes Hamas look like the volunteer fire department. So, I mean, and then you have the entire region that is now coalescing, as I pointed out, in this ethno-nationalist environment. And I think that's a combination that cannot be beaten. Same thing is true in Russia. Mr. Putin will have to make a decision at some point. He'll have to say, look, we've waited long enough. We'll just march to the Dnieper. And he may have to actually go into Kiev to make his point. He has understandably held back from that because he has resisted successfully this stereotype nonsense that all Russia wants to do is conquer, invade and conquer. He doesn't want to do that. That's patently obvious. We think we are leaving him no choice, and we may be right. We're forcing him, goading him, if you will, just as we did to get him into eastern Ukraine, to go further. And he may have to, just to make his point. But I do think things in Europe are changing. When I look at the Olaf Scholz regime, it seems to me that that's on very fragile ground. I don't think Mr. Macron in Paris is in a strong position by any means. Quite the opposite. France, if anything, is on the verge of a civil war, has been now for a few years. Who knows when that will break into the open? When I listen to the regime in Berlin talk about, well, we have to spend more money on defense to get ready for war with Russia, I burst out laughing, because I don't think very many astute Germans believe that at all. I do think he's worried about protecting himself and his regime. I think the globalists, the sort of neoconservative globalist Trotskyites, are in one important way very similar to Islamists. Once the Islamist wins the election, which is always the goal, to win democratically if you can do it, the Islamist is permanently in power. Well, you have a similar phenomenon in the West with the neoconservative globalist Trotskyites. Once they've gotten themselves into power, and they are in power at the moment, they have no intention of ever relinquishing it. This is sort of also similar to the Soviet bloc. You know, once a country has become communist, it must remain communist or Sovietized in perpetuity. That was Brezhnev's argument in 1968. Well, this is kind of the same thing, only now we're talking about this strange neocon globalist Trotskyitism or Trotskyism. You know, you're now part of this nameless amorphous mass. We've converted all of you to globalist citizens, people with no name, no identity, no purpose, no religion, no culture. You're living in this giant consumer-driven system, consumption machine. We're feeding you, we're clothing you, we're directing you, and you should love it because it's in your best interest. And we're never ever giving this up. I mean, that's the problem right now that you face and that we face inside the United States.
Yeah, well, in terms of the finding, well, reaching a settlement, it's quite extraordinary that even as Ukraine's losing, we still don't even warm up to negotiations by talking about neutrality. I noticed it's become quite extreme in that sense that we're only increasing the rhetoric. But I want to return very quickly to Israel because you previously mentioned you think this is going to spiral out of control and into a regional war, and it seems like we have two pathways now. One being the possibility of the U.S. and Israel going after Lebanon. And the second now appears to be possibly Yemen, as Yemen is, well, the Houthis, Yemenites are attacking the shipping lanes in the Red Sea. How likely do you see any of these wars taking place, or is it possible to contain it?
Well, I don't think I said it was inevitable it would spiral out of control, but I think it's very likely to do so. I think it's likely to become a regional conflict. Well, the region is very complex. Egypt is perhaps a keystone in the edifice of the security architecture that we erected in 1973 that has persisted for 50 years, and it is in danger of falling apart. Now, what do I mean by that? Sisi, who has a nation of tens of millions, I don't even know what the current population figures are for Egypt, but back in the 1970s, it was a little over 40 million. Today, I think it's closing in on 100 million. And this population is enraged at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Sisi is widely viewed inside his own country as an Israeli/American puppet because he's refused to take any action. We talk a great deal about leveling Gaza. We forget that Sisi leveled the city of Rafah, which is just on the other side of the border from Gaza. I mean, leveled it, really. We watched it go on in 2015. Part of this was connected to the larger war on Islamism in the Sinai, because you had ISIS or ISIS chapters and other ISIS-like elements spontaneously rising in the Sinai. And the Egyptians committed their own military power to deal with it because it was also naturally, in their eyes, bound up with criminality, smuggling and corruption and so forth. Rafah was leveled with a goal in mind of making it impossible for anyone to gain a foothold in in Sinai. And at the same time, he and his fellow elites viewed the people in Gaza as a catalyst for trouble. In other words, we don't want them because they'll just bring the war with Israel to Egypt. And we can't afford them. We have too many people as it is. We haven't got the infrastructure for them. We destroyed Rafah. There's nothing out there. So, we can't deal with this. Well, the tide has turned now. And you have, as I said before, this ethno-religious nationalism where people in Egypt are saying, wait a minute, these are Muslims like us. They're being exterminated. They're being driven like animals into the desert. How can we stand by and do nothing? And Sisi has walked this tightrope for a long time, but now he has to ask himself every morning, who among my senior military leaders is going to remove me on the grounds that Egypt must join the fight against Israel? This is a real concern. You have a different set of circumstances, but similar in some ways in Jordan, where the king of Jordan has always been a very close, strong, reliable friend, certainly since the 70s in the United States and the United Kingdom. He has a population that is overwhelmingly Palestinian. It is no longer even half and half. It used to be majority Bedouin and related, or at least connected to him in terms of loyalty and so forth. That's no longer the case. The Palestinians in Jordan are also enraged. They're seeing what's happening on the West Bank. We don't cover the West Bank, but there's a lot of violence in the West Bank, violence committed on both sides and specifically by settlers against the Arabs that live there. And of course, the government is encouraging what I would call preemptive strikes. In other words, it's almost in the same realm as Stalin's notion of prophylactic defense, kill the citizen before he has a chance to commit a crime. Well, in some respects, that's happening on the West Bank. And then we move over to Syria. Syria is comatose. Syria is a zombie. It's not recovered from this terrible civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or driven out of their homes. Assad wants to survive, and his enemy has historically been Mr. Erdogan, because Mr. Erdogan has been only too happy to support all the radical Islamist elements. He'll never admit it publicly, but he and his intelligence officers were very, very, very important players in the stand-up of ISIS that was supposed to attack Shiites. Only it became Frankenstein's monster and attacked in every direction against everybody. And now he is backed off from that because he realizes he has a greater and more powerful enemy, and that enemy is in Israel, to the point where he's now willing to talk to the Iranians, which is something he's never done before. So those are the situations north. When you go down into the Arabian Peninsula, you look at the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. The Emirates are at risk, and so's the House of Saud, because their populations are equally enraged at what is happening in Gaza. Now the Houthis step forward, and the Houthis have now begun interfering with commercial shipping traffic for all the reasons that they're Shiite Arabs and they want to demonstrate their commonality of purpose and ethnic nationalism with the people of Gaza. And we are answering this by saying, well, see, this is Iran provoking this, just as Iran is provoking Hezbollah, Iran is provoking the Shiite militias in Iraq and so forth. No, it's not really true. Iran has worked tirelessly to stay out of the fight. The Iranians want nothing to do with the war right now. And these Shiite Arab militias, if you want to call them that, they're acting on their national identity. What is that? Well, they are Arabs and Muslims. And so they are going to act one way or another against the West. Iran has to maintain good relations with them. They want to keep them on side, but they're not necessarily pushing them, because right now Iran and Saudi Arabia continue to hammer out agreements that are in both of their interests. So Iran really doesn't want this war to break out in a way that would destroy all the work that's being done by Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China to bring some measure of stability and peace to the region. And remember, the Chinese depend very heavily on the Persian Gulf, the oil and the gas, as well as food coming in from Africa. So they're not interested in a war in the region. And that brings you then around to Mr. Erdogan. Well, if you walk around Istanbul right now, there are signs all over the city about Israel, the apartheid state, Israel, the criminal state, the Israelis, war criminals. The population in Turkey is enraged. So Mr. Erdogan, who is being very comfortable posturing as what I would call a neo-Ottoman nationalist, now suddenly has a tiger in his tank, so to say. He's got a tiger that he's holding on to it. And at some point, he's going to have to decide what to do with the tiger, because he doesn't want the tiger to eat him. So I think I would say that all of these regimes, to one extent or another, are all riding their own version of a tiger. And they're trying to figure out how to keep the tiger from getting out of control. I think the tiger is going to get out of control. Because you're talking about feudal states in terms of political development and modernization in the peninsula and the Persian Gulf. And all of those places, the leadership can be very rapidly replaced by new leadership. I mean, relatives may step forward and say, I'll lead the crusade. At some point, they're all going to be driven to that outcome. And then here we sit, and we remain Israel's only real friend. And we're sitting offshore, and we're prepared to help them. I mean, we've flown and shipped in enormous quantities of ammunition and weapons, technology the Israelis need. And we're saying, please, please, try not to kill civilians. And the numbers of civilians keep dying in greater and greater numbers. I mean, the increase is unending. So we want this to end, but we're paralyzed because Mr. Netanyahu and his supporters in the United States have purchased the Senate and the House and the White House. And they have powerful backers, billionaires, who have provided plenty of money for a long period of time to ensure that the United States will provide unconditional support to Israel. So what's going to happen here in the United States, I think, is there's going to be a groundswell of people, mostly younger people, that are going to step up. It may end up looking like 69, 70, 71 in the United States during the Vietnam War, where people say, no more. We will not be a party to this. But the people on the Hill are still very comfortable receiving their benefits from supporting Israel unconditionally. So anybody who says, what happens next? Look at that puzzle now. If we attack the Houthis have made it clear they will destroy the oil refineries and the oil drilling platforms all over Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And people say, oh, well, that can't be done. No, it can be done. These are all very vulnerable installations. You don't even need to destroy all of them. If you destroy a portion, you're going to make a huge dent in the economic stability of the West and potentially China. And the Saudis are the ones now, even though they have been blood enemies of the Houthis, saying, please, please, don't push the Houthis. We don't want this. We want to get on with Iran. We want to get on with the rest of the world. And if you push the Houthis, it could destabilize us. Yeah, it could very definitely destabilize Saudi Arabia. We don't know which match is going to be lit and tossed into the powder room where all the gunpowder is stored. But there are a lot of matches out there, and several of them have already been lighted. It's a question of which one is tossed into the gunpowder storage facility and blows everything up. I think it's coming. And it's going to be enormous when it happens. And again, the rest of the world, the Europeans, they don't like the Muslim problem, if you will. They've got their own Muslims to deal with. But at the same time, they're not ready to go commit for Israel because they're not going to support what Israel wants to do in Gaza. On the American side, we're paralyzed. We're not leading. We have no strategy. We have no sense of limitation. Again, what are the limits on American power? We continue to pretend that there are none. But I think we've already demonstrated the limits of American power in Ukraine. And we're going to see these limits emerge even more starkly in the Middle East. So anything is possible, Glenn, but I think it will take a few more months for this to come together and coalesce in a way that becomes extremely dangerous. And I see no one trying to stop it.
It's quite extraordinary because I remember Richard Nixon making the point, yes, United States and Israel will always be close, but it's also in the U.S. interest to have a certain relationship with Arab states, such as Egypt. But it appears that the U.S. is, by signing up fully to Israel's war, it appears that they're willing to sacrifice a lot of these, all of the relationships in the whole region. So that's what I wanted to ask as well. Is there any wider discourse these days about the direction of America? Because, 30 years ago, after the Cold War, that's when Washington began to build this new world order, which has been referred to as liberal hegemony. So there would be one center of power. The world would unite behind the United States, and liberal values, which manifested itself in NATO expansion and all of this. But so at the same time, the main foreign policy objectives of our states, such as Russia and China, was, of course, to develop friendly ties with the US. So again, much reason for optimism. But if we forward 30 years, we see now that countries like Russia and China are aligning themselves against the US, primarily because of the hegemonic ambitions. So we see Europe not looking great, the United States losing its influence in the Middle East, possibly, the whole region could go on fire. And adding to this, of course, there's this very alarming economic, social, and political upheavals within the US. So I was just, putting all of these issues together, is there anything being discussed these days in Washington? Anyone has their pulse on the nation in terms of looking at the wider picture, rethinking the role of the United States in the world? Anyone want to pull back and recover economically, socially, instead of continuing to run an empire?
If you view the United States of America as a patient lying on the table, and after the patient has been examined, the physician says, you need a heart transplant. And then a series of other physicians walk in and say, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. There's nothing wrong with the heart. We'll just give the patient a haircut and a shave, and he'll be fine. That's where we are. Everyone wants to give us a haircut and a shave. No one wants to admit that the heart itself, the heart of America, is in great danger. And we need either a transplant, I think we need a transplant, or some very serious heart medicine. The heart medicine probably isn't going to come. So I think we're going to have a heart attack first. And then somebody will say, guess we were wrong. We're going to have major surgery. That's what I keep trying to tell people in Europe. I've told my friends in Israel this. I've told everyone who will listen. That's the problem in the United States. You think that we are perpetually powerful. You think that nothing has changed since 1991. You think the American brand is invulnerable, invincible forever. You are wrong. It never has been. It isn't now. And Americans are beginning to figure out they need a transplant. But still, too many Americans are really watching football and trying to find out what's happened in Taylor Swift's love life. I mean, literally. Sometimes people talk about bread and circuses in ancient Rome. Well, if we are in any way like the Romans, we're very absorbed with our attention, at any rate, is absorbed by bread and circuses. That's our problem. Now, that won't last because I think we're headed into very difficult financial times. I've long expected our financial system to implode. But again, no one believes that. It doesn't matter. If you talk to Nassim Taleb, if you haven't interviewed him, you should. And he will talk about the looming Armageddon. He will tell you that there's a pond out there with lots of black swans. They're all going to take off. Which one goes first is anybody's guess, but it's going to happen. Talk to Alistair MacLeod, who writes prolifically on the same subject and talks about the Russians very cleverly going increasingly in the direction of gold-backed currency and bringing China, India, and eventually the BRICS into that system. We can't do that for various reasons. That would destroy our monetary system. Even though we've effectively destroyed it ourselves, we can't go to the gold-backed approach. So I don't know what we're going to do in the West. But the point is, if you take those people on one side and you look at the realities, we can't recruit for the armed forces, not because Americans don't want Russia and that they would use Ukraine for that purpose. And they'd been building up to this for many, many years, not just the 8 years before the war broke out, but actually even earlier, which helps to explain the coup that occurred and the installation of the Zelensky government later on. All of it was fantasy. It made no sense. All the underlying assumptions were wrong. And the usual suspects in the Department of Defense, all of your retired generals and active generals, very few of whom ever had any practical military experience and seldom, if ever, bothered to study their professions, all jumped on the bandwagon predicting imminent victory for Ukraine. And everyone lied prolifically and with great convincing rhetoric day after day that the Russians were awful, they were losing, they had no chance to win. They still haven't admitted the truth, which is we're looking at roughly 500,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. This evening, I heard a retired general say, well, perhaps 125,000. Well, that's a fraction of what we know has happened. And he's still trying to make the argument that if we just spend more money and send more equipment, Ukraine will triumph. In reality, the Russians are advancing deliberately but slowly. I think Mr. Putin is looking for a negotiating partner among the European states. He's not interested in marching to the Polish border. But as I keep telling everyone, if we're stupid enough to refuse to negotiate, if we won't bring this stupid and pointless war to an end, not only will we destroy the Ukrainian nation, but we'll end up moving Russian forces that much further towards the West, which I thought was the very thing we wanted to avoid, as well as the massive expansion of the Russian armed forces. They are now mammoth, very well staffed, brilliantly officered, well led, well equipped. This is not what we set out to achieve.
So does that make our leaders fools or knaves? Fools because they didn't see what you and I could see, or knaves because they could see it and did it anyway?
I think it's probably a little of both. I mean, we've always had a problem. You have in Great Britain and we in the United States with senior military and political leaders who tended to be persuaded by wishful thinking that things were true that were not. This is simply another example. And you add to that corruption and greed and arrogance. I think the arrogance in Washington is at an all-time high. One would think after the decades of failure, military and strategic and political, and given the state of our economy and the financial system, everyone would have developed some measure of humility. Nothing could be further from the truth. No one will admit the truth. Everyone insists on the lie, and the arrogance continues.
It's very disturbing and entirely true also on this side of the Atlantic. He had a bad Tuesday, Zelensky, in Washington, but one of our correspondents has just briefed us that he had a better Wednesday. He had all the brass out there to greet him, and Lloyd Austin booming 9 different pledges in 1 minute, 45 seconds. What happened?
Well, I think he thought that he had access to the Epstein tapes and he was going to present those to President Biden and his colleagues and tell them he was going to release them if they didn't support him. Doesn't seem to have worked. Maybe the tapes weren't good enough, didn't have enough people on them. I don't know. The generals are just waiting around to retire and pick up lucrative contracts with the defense industry. So they're performing not just for their political sponsors that advanced them to senior rank, they're performing for their future bosses and the shareholders, reassuring them that they can sell anything that they produce to anyone. Whether we win or lose doesn't make any difference. And apparently they've got a point. But I think this is going to be tough to conceal. The rest of the world knows what has happened, Mr. Galloway. And what has happened is very clear. Not only has this Western-trained Ukrainian force failed miserably for reasons that are not entirely its fault, but because of the way we trained it, organized it, and equipped it. In addition to that, our technology has failed miserably. Our advice has been appalling. I mean, if in retrospect, I'm surprised President Putin hasn't offered to reimburse London and Washington for the cost of sending all the retired generals over there to advise them, because they've been his greatest assets. It's been stupidity on stilts, an unwillingness to see how profoundly warfare has changed, a desire to see Russians as mediocre and subhuman. It's outrageous nonsense. It was never true. And now, as you know, I'm sure you're aware, we've poisoned the well with Russia for at least a decade or more. I can't imagine why the Russians would pay any attention to anything we say. Everything we've told them was a lie. Everything we've done has been aimed at subverting them and alienating them. And I think that's a serious mistake. I hope we can get a new generation of political leaders in there that can turn it around. But that's, in my judgment, the worst part. And the rest of the world now knows we're weak. And I think that weakness is going to be on display increasingly in the future. And I would include in that the Middle East. We are not the power we were 30 years ago. We're not even close.
Well, undoubtedly, and I was speaking earlier, I was in the UAE when President Putin arrived. You could see, you could feel, it's palpable, the extent to which the formerly, well, to say the least, friends and allies of the West have begun to reorientate towards the East. Insofar as we struggled mightily to lift a huge stone, we really have dropped it on our own feet, haven't we? Russia is stronger and richer. Russia is stronger and militarily more powerful. Its prestige has grown. Its armed forces now tried and tested. It's a thoroughgoing disaster, all this. And the leaders who led us into it really ought to pay a price if democracy means anything.
Well, you've got to get people informed. And this is something that's acutely lacking in the United States. If you ask most Americans, what are you doing tonight? They're looking for the latest football game. They're trying to find out who Taylor Swift is going to date next week. If you ask them about what's happening in the Middle East, they sort of shrug their shoulders. They're not terribly interested. They think this is a minor dust-up that will soon be over, as was the case in previous occasions with the Israelis and the Arabs. And, you know, Arabs have also been through the ringer as well here in the United States. It was easy to convince people the Russians were bad simply because of the Cold War. All you had to do was dust off the Cold War propaganda and throw it at them. Well, now you have the same problem, unfortunately, with Muslim Arabs. Oh, Muslim Arabs, we've been fighting them for years. The hell with them. Let's hope the Israelis do a great job. With no understanding of the situation, of the humanitarian dimension, and no real interest. This is all going to come back and harm us in the long run. But for the moment, strategically, it's not having any impact here. No, nothing is penetrating the American public.
You know far more about warfare than I, but when I look at the situation in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, it looks to me like the asymmetrical warfare in which the common man can inflict wholly disproportionate damage and cost on his enemy. The Houthis, for example, a ragged-assed army, a kind of Taliban on wheels, now have the ability to bring shipping in the Red Sea to a halt at a cost of uncountable billions of dollars for people having to sail their ships around a continent instead, or pay insurance at an exorbitant price, because there's a pretty good chance the Houthis will stick a missile up your jumper if you sail past them. This is a remarkable turnaround, isn't it?
Well, the Houthis have actually practically shut down the Suez Canal for much of the commercial traffic. That's a tremendous achievement. We haven't had to have a collision or an explosion in the Suez, and people are now sailing all the way around the Cape to avoid going through the Red Sea. I'm waiting for someone in Washington to make the decision to commit 5,000 or 10,000 Marine infantry or something to land in Yemen. And, you know, based on the experience in Yemen that the British had, I can only imagine that would be a very unrewarding experience, dealing with the Houthis and running around in the mountains down there. No one wants to talk to anybody. Again, you know, before you launch, why not talk to people? You know, one thing that the British always did very well before they went anywhere is that they ask this question: how do we practice economy of enemies? Who will work with us and who won't? And eventually they narrowed it down to just a very small number of people who would oppose them. And they had help from others around them. That was Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was a genius at this sort of thing, the real James Bond of the 19th century. We don't have anybody thinking like that. We go in with a sledgehammer. We smash everything. We smash everybody. And then we wonder why nobody likes us and everybody wants us out. We have no friends today in Iraq. Nobody in Syria wants us except some of the Kurds. And it's not even all the Kurds. It's a minority of them. But we've managed to alienate the Iranians, the Turks, as well as all of the Arabs. So I think we're in for a long war. People think, well, you know, the Israelis will finish up in Gaza over the next few weeks. Well, finish up means expel or kill everybody who's left. Now they're going to pump some seawater into the tunnels. I'm sure that'll get rid of some of them, in addition to destroying the water table and making the place unlivable. But I see this as dragging on. I see things changing in the Muslim world. And there's this concept called Asadiyya that goes back to Ibn Khaldun, the famous Muslim historiographer. And he talked about social cohesion and the impact of Islam on the peoples that lived within the Islamic world. And he said, you know, no one has ever seen the power of Islam, fully appreciates what it can do. Well, today the world is different. The people in this region are better educated, they have access to technology, and they know what's happening. Hundreds of millions of people, Turks, Arabs, Iranians, Egyptians, everyone knows what's happening. Anyone who thinks that this is going to end soon is wrong. I think this is the beginning of a very dangerous period. And frankly, I think the Israelis have grossly underestimated the impact of their actions. And at the same time, we don't seem to understand it. We're sitting out there on board our aircraft carriers, waiting for the word to fly strikes. And we're trying very hard to split the Lebanese government from Hezbollah, cutting deals and agreements in the hopes that will keep Hezbollah out. But in the long run, I don't see that happening. I think things are going to get worse, particularly in the spring. We may have a pause, a temporary ceasefire, but this is going to turn into a long, ugly war that none of us are going to like.
I know you're a patriotic American, and I swear I say this not to hurt your feelings at all, but as I watch the decline, steep and rapid, of your president, such that in his latest pronunciamento, he thrice declared that the events of October 7th were 65 years ago instead of 65 days ago, and that allowed him to have a walk-on part for his father, who died 20 years ago, returning to his kibbutz. This is not a well man. As we say in Scotland, you would not send that man out for a loaf, never mind to rule and govern the most powerful country in the world. Of how much more of this can the American people put?
Well, a lot of us have asked that question. I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind that Biden is not governing anything. And whatever he says, whatever he signs is put in front of him by other people. The other people are committed to two things. They're committed to the extension of this war in Ukraine. They're committed to unlimited spending. They're committed to backing whatever is required in the Middle East that Israel demands. And they control events. The American people, as I said, aren't paying a great deal of attention right now. But it will take something major to get their attention, something that hits them at home. Now, we've got problems here. Don't mistake that. We have open borders, rising criminality. Lots of Americans are saying, sure, we like the Israelis, but why are we sending all of this money to Israel and Ukraine when we have open borders, when we can't even maintain effective armed forces, when people won't join it? I mean, all this diversity, inclusion, and equity is killing us in the military. And we have so denigrated the role that men play, particularly white men, that the armed forces are suffering for that dramatically. You know, somebody once said, was complaining about the numbers of British soldiers, and Disraeli made the comment, no one complained about the numbers of British soldiers at Waterloo. Well, I like to point out that no one complained about the numbers of white men fighting in the armed forces at Okinawa or Midway or Normandy or anywhere else. But we're in a lot of trouble, Mr. Galloway. We've lost our way. We've lost our sense of purpose. We've lost our sense of identity. And all of these things are going to come out in the months ahead. And I hope that we can weather this and recover. But right now, we are admittedly in a lot of trouble, and we are not in a position to wage a major regional war. And no one should exclude that possibility. That could happen. There are a lot of people in Washington working closely with Jerusalem to spark a war with Iran. And that would be, in my judgment, both unnecessary and catastrophic. If that happens, anyone who thinks that Russia will stand by and watch us destroy Iran is crazy. And the Chinese at this point have enormous investments in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. They depend heavily on the oil and gas. They don't want to see that shut down. So you're talking about the simple truth is this. No one in the region, in the Near East or Southwest Asia or Eastern Europe wants a war except us.
Chilling indeed. Tell us about your new role, Colonel, Our Country, Our Choice. What is that, and what do you hope to achieve?
Our Country, Our Choice was formed before I showed up by a group of people who simply decided it doesn't make any difference for whom we vote. We get the same bad policies. They've discovered that we have this thing called the Uniparty, where everyone has his hand out, everyone's enriching him or herself. And that's why you don't have debates. You have very few discussions. The fight is over money. It's not over anything of substance. And we're busy falling all over ourselves to ship money overseas, largely because it results in arms sales that enrich people, and no one gives a damn about our border. Oh, a few people raise their hands and say, well, this is bad, that's unfortunate. No one seems to care about the rule of law. So they said, would you come in and be the CEO and try to be a spokesman for the people in the United States who feel disenfranchised? And our numbers are growing rapidly. I think they're going to grow a lot more next year as people begin to figure out, why should I worry about who wins the election when everything stays the same? Who's really going to step forward with a new team and say, it's over, we're going to stop it? Who's going to really cut spending? It's impossible. You can't cut spending. We have to print more money. Well, the more you do, the more likely you are to fall apart. Everybody in the United States understands this, but now I see tens of thousands of people who are coming forward and want this to end. So there are a lot of other issues that we don't like. We don't like the sexualization of children. You know, we're tired of the human trafficking as well as the drugs that pour into our country. We're tired of criminals who are not tried and dealt with as harshly as possible. Everything's out of control. Our internally, we are crumbling, and everybody knows it. And that includes hundreds of thousands of veterans who are going to flock to our colors because they see nowhere else to go, and they're sick of it because many of them have suffered terribly. And the question is, for what? What did we achieve in Afghanistan? What did we achieve in Iraq? What did we achieve anywhere? Well, we all know the answer. Strategically, for us, nothing. But lots of people in Washington live at the top of the food chain. They're doing quite well. In the meantime, food is up 35%, and it's getting worse. People are having trouble putting food on the table. Not in Washington. No, not in the gated neighborhoods, not in Manhattan. You know, we're talking about the average American. This is not going to go on long. So this is what we're about. And we want to end these overseas conflicts. We want to defend the border. We want to expel the illegals. We want to restore the rule of law. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of inquiries from overseas. In fact, a number of people from the continent, India, are asking questions. Can we form a similar chapter? And I think that could happen at some point. And what we're doing now is we're benefiting from the investment that many people are making. We're trying to make it possible for people to join us without spending any money. The last thing we want to do is take money from Americans who need it.
That's extraordinarily powerful message, and I know about messaging. I feel there is, I don't know, an overlap perhaps with Mr. Carlson, Tucker Carlson, who is also an extremely powerful exponent of the kind of counsel of despair at the political class in Washington. Have you thought about joining up together, you and Tucker?
Well, he's been very supportive of us to this point.